The first time Private Alfred Hennings saw one up close, he mistook it for a stray dog. Not because of its bark or its gait, there was none of that, but because of the sheer size of it. The creature moved slowly, deliberately, picking its way through the muck with a confidence that no animal should have in such a place. It slithered forward on feet too steady for the trembling ground beneath them, its matted fur slicked with rot and rain, its eyes glassy, black as coal. When it passed within inches of Alfred's boot, he didn't breathe. Not because he was afraid it would bite, though it might, but because in that moment he realized something terrible. It wasn't afraid of him. It had no reason to be. By then, the trench had settled into a rhythm of decay. The walls sagged inward, bloated with days of relentless drizzle. Duckboards, laid to keep feet dry, floated now on inches of brackish water, and the stench of wet wool, urine, and something else, something meteor, hung in the air like fog. Shellfire came and went in irregular bursts, far enough away to dull the sense of urgency but close enough to keep the nerves raw. Above them, the sky drooped in gray folds, heavy with secrets and sickness. Beneath, in the thin layer of life left to the living, the rats ran their kingdom. And they ran it without fear. To a new soldier, the trench was already a kind of death. The rifles, the gas, the shelling, these things made sense. They had rules. You kept your head down, your mask close, your boots laced. You followed orders. You looked east toward the enemy. But there was no rule for rats. No drills. No warnings before they came. They moved beneath you, beside you, sometimes over you, and there was nothing you could do but flinch. Flinching was useless, of course. If a rat wanted to run across your chest while you slept, it would. If it wanted your bread, it took it. If it wanted the corpse beside you, it claimed it, beginning not at the skin but at the soft, generous parts. The eyes, the lips, the belly. Men didn't talk about it much. At least, not in the way they talked about gas attacks or bayonet charges. Rat stories were passed along like myths, shared in half-whispers over cold tea, almost always ending with a grimace or a shudder. Not fear exactly, more a kind of exhausted resignation. Because to fear something, you had to believe you could resist it. And no one believed that anymore. Not after the first few nights. Not after you heard them screaming. Yes, screaming. The rats screamed sometimes. Or maybe it was the wind, no one could be sure. Maybe it was the dying. The thing about trench rats wasn't just that they were there. It was that they belonged there, as much a part of the trench as the sandbags and barbed wire. They were born of it, fed by it. Fat, glistening things with glutted bellies and blood-slicked tails. And you couldn't kill them fast enough. For every one you crushed with the butt of your rifle, there were 5 more, slipping through the cracks, chewing through your boots, your packs, your thoughts. It wasn't just their numbers. It was what they knew, or seemed to know. They came when things were quietest, when the guns paused just long enough for men to pretend they might sleep. They waited until you closed your eyes, until the last murmurs had died down and your breathing settled. That's when you felt them. A twitch at your ankle, the weight of something moving across your thigh. And worse, the sound. Not loud, never loud, but insistent. A wet, clicking rustle. You told yourself it was your imagination, that it was water or wind or dreams. But the dreams were worse. A man could endure the madness of war, the randomness of it, if he believed in the enemy across the wire. If he could name the danger, picture it, aim at it. But the rats, these were not the enemy. They were the rot made visible. The war given legs. You couldn't aim at them. And even if you did, the bullet would be wasted. Some tried traps. Some swung spades. One man, Davies, swore by his father's old hunting whistle, claimed the sound drove them off. But a week later, he woke to find one nestled inside his helmet. Its teeth sunk into the meat of his ear. What kind of war lets this happen? What kind of hell breeds a creature like that? And more urgently, why did these animals, lowly and mindless as they seemed, inspire more dread than any German bullet? Why was it that men hardened by months of shelling could be reduced to sobbing fits by the simple skitter of paws in the dark? These were the questions that crept in during the longest nights, when the fire ceased and the silence became a weight of its own. when the rats seemed not only to own the trench but to judge it. This is where the question truly takes hold, not in the telling of isolated incidents or the recounting of grisly encounters, but in the atmosphere they created. The way they occupied not just the physical spaces but the psychological ones. How they became, in a sense, the ultimate expression of everything wrong with this war. The filth, the stagnation, the slow, impersonal erosion of the human spirit. What follows is not just a catalogue of horrors. It's an inquiry, peeling back of layers. We'll move through the trenches as they were, speak to the voices that endured them, and consider the factors, environmental, emotional, symbolic, that made these rats not just pests, but emblems of the war's madness. From their grotesque biology to their mythologized presence in soldiers' lore, each thread reveals a part of the larger tapestry. Not simply how the rats lived, but what they meant, why they stayed, and why, for some, they never truly left. No one prepared them for this. In all the drills, in all the shouted commands and staged maneuvers, there was never a moment when an officer said, "This is how you survive when the ground beneath you is alive." The manuals spoke of terrain, of enemy formations, of weather conditions, but never of the simple, terrifying fact that the earth itself would crawl, that the walls would move in the dark, that the corpses would not rest. Most recruits arrived at the front with a nervous kind of eagerness. Not excitement exactly, but the energy of uncertainty. They carried with them all the imagined horrors of war. Bullets tearing through the air, the crush of bodies in a charge, the blinding chaos of artillery fire. But none of them pictured waking up to a rat on their chest, licking the sweat from their neck. None of them envisioned peeling back a blanket and revealing a nest of them, squirming in warmth stolen from a still warm corpse. The horror wasn't in the drama. It was in the intimacy. They learned quickly that this wasn't a story of grand battles. It was a war of inches, fought not just against the enemy but against the ground itself, against the water that refused to drain, against the cold that seeped through every layer of cloth, against the rats that watched you always from the edges of vision. They were everywhere and nowhere, too fast to catch, too cunning to trap. One moment you heard them gnawing at your haversack, the next you felt the soft scuffle of paws in your kit. Sometimes they squealed, a high-pitched shriek that tore through the stillness like wire. Other times, they simply stared, unmoving, as though waiting for something you didn't yet understand. There were nights when even the veterans, those who had survived the worst of it, would curl in on themselves, shielding their faces not from shell fragments but from whiskers. Nights when the rats moved in such numbers that it seemed the trench was liquid with them. Men laid awake in silence, too proud to scream, too broken to sleep, letting their hands rest on knives they wouldn't use. Killing one was useless. It solved nothing. The stink brought more. The sound brought more. And in the end, even the dead belonged to the rats. This was the secret shame of trench life, the understanding that your body would not be honored, that it would not be carried home in glory, nor left untouched in the cold. If you died, you became food. That was the simple, hideous truth, and everyone knew it. They never said it aloud. It didn't need to be said. It was understood in the quiet way men turned their eyes from the corpses, in the way they winced when the rats got too close to the wounded, in the way they buried their own with stones and sticks and shovelfuls of mud, desperate to keep the vermin out for just one more night. And yet, it wasn't just the fear of consumption. That would have been manageable, even rational. No, the deeper terror lay in the feeling that the rats weren't simply surviving alongside the soldiers. They were thriving, flourishing, growing fatter, bolder, smarter, as if the war were a feast laid out for them, as if the suffering of men had fertilized the ground for something older, something more primal. The war gave birth to many monsters, but none so mundane, so consistent, so unstoppable as these creatures. To understand their power, you have to look not only at what they did, but at when they did it. The timing. It was always the timing. Just as men began to forget themselves, to lose the edges of their sanity, the rats would come, as if summoned by despair. There were stories, strange, fevered things, of men who swore the rats whispered, that they spoke in dreams, that they moved in patterns purposeful and deliberate, that they carried messages not between men, but between worlds. Of course, these were hallucinations. Dreams born of exhaustion and trauma, weren't they? Still, the tales spread, and not just among the superstitious. Even the most rational men began to wonder, how could animals learn to distinguish between the living and the dead? How could they sense when death was coming? More than once, a soldier noted that the rats grew bolder around a man whose wounds were fatal. They gathered, waited. It wasn't just survival, it was prediction, premonition, as though they knew. You began to see them not as animals, but as omens. Their presence no longer incidental, but inevitable. A soldier might take cover from mortar fire and emerge unscathed, but find his bedroll overrun. He might survive the night, but wake to find them feasting on the leg of a man he'd shared biscuits with hours earlier. There was no winning against this. No victory, no strategy. Just the slow erosion of resistance, the daily ritual of tolerating the intolerable. And that, perhaps, was the war's cruelest achievement. Not the injury, nor even the death, but the normalization of horror. The way men adjusted their definitions of comfort, of cleanliness, of dignity. When a man stopped brushing the rats away from his boots, it wasn't because he no longer noticed them. It was because he'd accepted them. Accepted that they, too, had a place here. That the war was theirs as much as his. The questions began to take on a new shape. No longer why are they here, or how do we stop them? But something deeper, more unsettling. What do they see in us? The rats, unflinching and observant, moved like judges through the filth. They saw everything, every weakness, every breakdown, every burial, and they remembered. You could feel it in their stillness, in the way they paused before moving. They didn't fear men because they knew better. They knew the truth of this place, that strength was a myth, that all flesh rotted, that no amount of courage could stop the slow march of decay. The war had many faces, and most of them wore helmets. But some, perhaps the most enduring, wore fur. Not the fur of flags or banners, but the low, twitching kind, close to the ground, close to the gut, close to the truth. It didn't begin with a plan. Not in the way generals like to imagine, with maps spread out under lanterns and fingers tracing lines through France. The trenches were not born of strategy, but of necessity. Dug first in panic, then in desperation, and finally in resignation. At the start, in the warm confusion of August 1914, the war was still one of movement. Cavalry charges, open fields, skirmishes where men could see one another's eyes. But that world collapsed within months. And what replaced it was a wound stretching hundreds of miles across Europe's skin. Shallow at first, then deeper, darker, infested. The idea that men would live in holes weeks, months, even years at a time, was not an invention of genius, but an admission of failure. The firepower was too great, the casualties too quick. Every open advance was punished with death, and so the earth became the only refuge. Shovels replaced bayonets. The enemy wasn't just across the field. He was across the mud wall, close enough to smell, to hear, to hate without ever truly seeing. This was not the war they had trained for. It was a kind of burial, prolonged and breathing. The design of the trenches evolved as the war ground forward, shaped less by architecture than by endurance. What began as simple ditches soon spiraled into complex systems of zigzagging pathways, fire steps, dugouts, saps, and communication trenches. But no amount of engineering could outpace the rot. The soil was soft, heavy with moisture and clay. Rain turned it into a sucking, viscous sludge that swallowed boots, tools, memories. Drainage was a luxury. Most of the time, the trenches held water like wounds hold pus, reluctantly, stubbornly refusing to close. And where there is water, warmth, and the omnipresence of death, there is life of another kind. Rats had been part of military life for centuries. Soldiers in Crimea, in the Boer War, even in the barracks of peace had known them. But nothing matched what emerged in the trenches of the Western Front. This wasn't a nuisance. It was an infestation on a biblical scale. The structure of trench warfare didn't just tolerate vermin. It invited them. Every element of the environment, every compromise made in the name of survival, opened new doors for the unwanted. The trenches were often carved into low-lying farmland, already riddled with burrowing creatures, already rich with roots, manure, and the leftovers of rural life. Add to this the discarded rations, the refuse of hundreds of men crammed into close quarters, the absence of proper waste disposal, and you had an ecosystem primed for explosion. Latrines overflowed, cans rusted in heaps, food spoiled faster than it could be eaten. Every corner, every crevice, offered warmth and shelter, and the rats came. But it wasn't just the waste. It was the rhythm. The static nature of trench life allowed colonies to form, generations to breed without interruption. No advancing line to disrupt nests. No burning of the ground. These trenches, stagnant as they were, became long, narrow cities. Not only for soldiers, but for the creatures that lived beneath and around them. The front lines barely moved for years, and so the rats settled in. There was no shortage of sustenance. Every battle, every exchange of fire, left behind a trail of casualties. Corpses couldn't always be buried, certainly not quickly. Sometimes they were left exposed for days. Sometimes they were buried shallowly, and rain or shelling unearthed them. In the worst cases, the dead were absorbed into the trench itself, pressed into the walls, hidden beneath the duckboards, forgotten but not alone. And the rats, efficient as ever, found them. They grew fat on this feast, larger than anyone expected. Some were mistaken for cats. Their eyes glinted red in the dark, their bodies sleek with oils drawn from rot and marrow. Soldiers told tales of rats so bold they would drag biscuits from hands, chew through packs while men still wore them, gnaw on boots still laced to living feet. These were not timid scavengers. They were adapted predators, molded perfectly by the environment that trench warfare provided. Their numbers were impossible to count. At night, it seemed the ground itself rippled. Men reported waking to find dozens in a single dugout. A sergeant once claimed he counted over 80 rats beneath a fallen sandbag. Whether true or not, the figures hardly mattered. What mattered was the feeling that they were everywhere, always, watching, listening, waiting. The trenches may have belonged to soldiers by function, but by occupancy, they were the rats' domain. And here, again, the structure of the trenches played its part. The network of communication lines, the layers of frontline, support, and reserve trenches, all connected by miles of narrow, often unguarded paths, became a perfect superhighway. Rats moved freely from one sector to another, from one company to the next. They carried with them not just the scent of death, but its agents, lice, fleas, diseases. The movement of men could be controlled with orders. The movement of rats could not. Even the materials used in trench construction contributed to the problem. Sandbags, filled with whatever dirt was available, often became nests. Wooden planks rotted and split, making homes beneath them. The canvas and hessian linings used in dugouts tore easily, allowing entry. Every attempt at fortification doubled as an invitation. And once inside, there was no getting rid of them. They called them trench rats, as though war had created them. But these creatures had been around far longer than the war, longer even than men's efforts to civilize the world they lived in. The brown rat, Ratus norvegicus, had followed humanity for centuries, a quiet shadow at the edges of growth, feeding on the excess, slipping through the cracks. Cities knew them, ships carried them, but it was the war, and specifically the trenches, that allowed them to emerge from the periphery and take center stage in a theater of horror they were perfectly suited for. They were not large at birth. A newborn rat, hairless and blind, weighed only a few grams, but it didn't stay that way for long. With a gestation period of just over 3 weeks, and litters that often exceeded a dozen, the brown rat bred at a rate that defied control. A single female, in ideal conditions, could produce upwards of 7 litters in a year. In the chaos of trench life, abundant food, warmth, and shelter, the conditions weren't just ideal. They were grotesquely perfect. The result was exponential. What began as a pair became a dozen. What was a dozen became hundreds. In weeks, A trench sector could transform from tolerable to overrun. It was their adaptability that made them remarkable. Other animals might perish in wet, crowded, diseased environments, but rats adapted. Their fur, coarse and oily, repelled water and allowed them to move through flooded chambers with ease. Their long tails helped regulate heat, a small evolutionary detail that became a critical asset in the cold damp of France and Belgium. And their senses, keen hearing, a nose that could trace scent trails across muddy corpses, eyes adapted to the dark, gave them dominance over the night. The same hours when soldiers curled into themselves in silence were when the rats came alive. They were not aimless. Their movement had purpose, learned patterns shaped by experience. They knew where to find scraps. Bits of biscuit dropped in haste, tins tossed aside, even human waste left uncovered. But more than anything, they knew the scent of blood. They recognized it as food long before soldiers learned to accept that fact. When a man was wounded and left unattended, the rats would come. Not out of cruelty, but instinct. They didn't distinguish between the fallen and the dying. Warm flesh was warm flesh, and the wounded, trapped in the same narrow spaces, unable to flee or fight, bore witness to what the rats truly were. It wasn't just the feeding that unsettled men. It was the boldness. These were not animals that fled at the sound of boots. They stared back. Some were seen dragging body parts, fingers, ears, even strips of torn uniform, into dark corners. They moved like creatures with nothing to fear. Some would crawl over sleeping men, sniffing faces, tasting sweat, assessing life. There were stories, countless, whispered, half-believed, of rats chewing on the extremities of the living, testing whether motion meant survival or simply residual twitch. These weren't hallucinations. They were reports passed between companies, confirmed in the still morning light by blood on blankets and bite marks on skin. They had become more than scavengers. They were part of the trench itself. Their squeals became the soundtrack of night. Their movement, a constant peripheral flicker in the vision of exhausted soldiers. Attempts to kill them with bayonets or boots proved futile. For every one killed, 10 more took its place. Cats brought to the front lines were quickly overwhelmed. Traps clogged and failed. Poison worked briefly but tainted rations and endangered men. And when the rats died, they rotted quickly, adding their bodies to the endless layer of decay already pressing in from all sides. And yet, there was something else. Something harder to define. Presence. The rats weren't merely surviving, they were watching. Soldiers often spoke of this, usually at night, half joking, half horrified. The idea that the rats understood. That they knew which bodies could not scream. That they sensed when death had arrived or was moments away. There were times when men began to bleed, and before the medics could arrive, the rats had already gathered. As if summoned, as if they'd been waiting. They watched without blinking, without flinching, and when they moved, it was always as one. No communication visible, no sound exchanged, just a shared, sudden response, as if a single thought passed between dozens of bodies. This eerie synchronicity disturbed men more deeply than the bites or the stench. It suggested not chaos but coordination. And in a war where even human commands were often lost to noise, the idea that these creatures moved in silent understanding gave them a kind of mythic power. No one dared call it intelligence, at least not in daylight. But at night, when the rats returned in waves and their eyes gleamed like pinpricks across the duckboards, the stories came out. Of men who claimed the rats would pause just before entering a dugout, as if sensing something inside. Of rats that returned to the same body night after night, never stripping it clean in one go, but feeding as though in ritual. The term uncanny was used sparingly in the army, but it clung to the rats like mud on boots. Their behavior defied the label of mere pest. What made them especially terrifying was how they existed in the space between life and death. Not just in what they fed on, but in how they moved through a world built on fear and silence. The rats were constant. Shells came and went, barges roared and faded, officers rotated, friends died, but the rats remained. Their ability to endure what broke men earned them a grim kind of respect. Not admiration, never that, but a weary acknowledgement that they had won something here, in this frozen landscape of ruin and nerve. Their habits only deepened this impression. They were strictly nocturnal, not from fear of light but because they had adapted to the rhythms of the trench. They knew when rations were distributed, when men slept, when shifts changed. Their appearance at dusk was so reliable that soldiers could mark time by it. The first squeaks meant lights out. The patter of claws signaled another night of vigilance, not for snipers or bombs, but for the teeth beneath the blankets. The rats kept time in a war that had otherwise lost all sense of order. Their routes, too, followed patterns. They memorized tunnels, trench lines, dugout entrances. They returned to latrines that overflowed, to cooking areas where spills had seeped into the ground, to burial mounds recently disturbed by rain or shrapnel. And always they avoided the unnatural. Freshly laid traps, newly constructed barricades. These they skirted with ease. They learned faster than the soldiers. When fire was used, they vanished for a night, then reappeared through new tunnels. When boards were nailed down, they chewed around the edges. The trench, to them, was not a maze but a home with a shifting floor plan. Men would sometimes attempt to block off sections where rats were particularly thick, walling up side trenches or burning out nests. It never worked. The rats had already moved on before the plans were finished. Their breeding ensured that every attempt at extermination was too little, too late. Within days, the numbers would swell again. A single mother rat could give birth to 24 young in a month, and those offspring reached breeding age within 5 weeks. This wasn't infestation. It was multiplication as a form of occupation. But what unnerved soldiers more than numbers was behavior. The rats didn't behave like animals forced into desperation. They moved with confidence. Their scavenging lacked the frantic urgency seen in other vermin. They didn't dart. They strolled. They paused. They examined. And above all, they persisted. There was no repelling them, only delaying. No avoiding them, only enduring. And slowly, over time, the soldiers adapted not in strength but in numbness. They stopped brushing them away unless bitten. They stopped covering the food unless it was untouched. The rats had conditioned the men more thoroughly than the war itself had managed to do. Even their sounds took on a new weight. At first, the squeaks and rustling were simply irritating, then alarming, then something worse. For many, they became the soundtrack of helplessness. Men on sentry duty reported hallucinating rat noises during silent periods, convinced they were surrounded. In shell-shocked soldiers, the noise of rats often triggered more panic than artillery. The association ran deep. In every dark moment, the rat was there. When a friend died, when a wound festered, when sleep brought too many dreams. The sound of them meant something was ending or had already ended. There were mornings when men woke up with bites on their fingers, the skin ragged and swollen, blood smeared along their sleeves where they had unknowingly scratched in their sleep. Sometimes it was toes. Other times it was the corners of their mouths. In the half-light of dawn, with breath hanging like mist in the trench air, there was always a moment of stillness when a soldier would lift the blanket and scan the ground. And there, without fail, would be the droppings. A trail across the floorboards, a hole gnawed into a pack, a ration tin overturned. The rats had been again. There was no space they couldn't enter. Dugouts were meant to be a retreat, a place to sit, eat, sleep, maybe write if the shelling wasn't too close. But even in the most secure timber-lined bunkers, the sound of scratching could be heard in the corners, in the roof beams, in the spaces between sandbags. They burrowed down beneath the duckboards, emerging at night or even in the quietest stretches of day, never hesitating. Food was their prize, but it was more than that. The entire life of the trench was material for them. Cloth, paper, leather, soap, even candles. Anything was fair game. The raids on rations were the most demoralizing. Every man was given just enough, barely enough, to last through the next rotation. A few biscuits, tinned meat, perhaps a bit of jam if the quartermaster was feeling generous. But once the rats discovered the supply sacks, they struck with ruthless precision. They chewed through canvas like it was parchment, dragging biscuits into holes, hollowing out loaves of bread until only a crust remained. Meat tins were no obstacle if left unguarded. A sharp-toothed rat could bore through the tin lid's edge with hours of gnawing. And they didn't just take food, they contaminated it. Urine, droppings, hair. Rations were abandoned not because they were gone, but because they were spoiled. Private Leonard Graves of the 12th West Yorks recorded in his diary. This morning I reached for the bully beef and found the lid askew. Some gray bastard had already opened it. Took the better part of the meat. The rest of it stank like the dead. Can't eat it. Can't sleep. I think one was on my chest in the night. I swatted at it in my sleep and woke up bleeding. The entry was not unusual. Dozens more like it circulated in whispers and letters. Some men tried hanging their rations from the ceiling with string or wire, improvising larders above the ground. The rats climbed the walls with ease. Nothing was safe. Packs were gnawed open as men slept, the drawstrings chewed, buttons snapped off. Rifle slings were found half-shredded. Bootlaces vanished overnight. Soap disappeared within minutes of being unwrapped, possibly attracted by the scent, or perhaps mistaken for fat. Soldiers stopped leaving anything unattended. And still the rats found ways. One man woke to find the corner of his greatcoat frayed and warm with rat urine. Another heard the distinct, grating sound of his shaving brush being dragged across the floor by something just out of reach. He didn't chase it. He just lay still, listening to the faint thud of bristles as they disappeared into the earth. The damage went deeper than supplies. Burrowing was constant. Beneath the dugouts, behind the sandbags, under the wooden boards that served as both flooring and grave cover. Their tunnels threaded through the trench wall like veins. In heavy rain, these tunnels collapsed, weakening whole sections of trench. Sentries would suddenly find the ground sagging beneath them, the boards tipping as the soil gave way. In the worst cases, the rat holes would open just enough to create a trip hazard, a narrow slit that swallowed a boot or turned an ankle. Some feared them because they knew what they connected to. Nests, warrens filled with squirming young, and deeper still, the remains of things dragged below. A corporal in the king's own Scottish borderers once described waking to the sound of gurgling beneath his head. The dugout wall had been hollowed by rats, and the shifting weight of men sleeping above had squeezed the burrow into collapse. Dozens of rats burst out as the soil gave way. He wrote that he tried to scream but couldn't. They had already climbed onto his chest. His blanket was sodden by the end of it, not from rain, but from the warm stink of their bodies. The stink lingered long after the rats were gone, seeping into the folds of uniforms, embedding itself in canvas and wool. No amount of scrubbing or airing could remove it entirely. It became part of the scent of trench life, along with cordite, latrine pits, and mildew. Soldiers could often identify infested dugouts before setting foot inside, not by sight or sound, but by smell alone. And once that smell took root, it spread. It clung to letters sent home, to blankets rolled up for inspection, to the very breath of men who had spent weeks living beside the nests. You could tell a trench veteran not by his medals or his stare, but by the way he unconsciously flinched at the faint rustle of paper or a scuttling footfall in a quiet room. For some, the daily routines began to form around the rats rather than in spite of them. Boots were placed upright and close together to discourage entry. Food tins were double-wrapped, tied in bundles, and buried in the mud beside bedrolls. Equipment was inspected for chew marks as regularly as for rust. Lamps were never left burning unless watched. One man wrote that he began sleeping with his boots under his head, not for safety, but because waking up to find the heel chewed off meant an entire day of foot agony in the mud. Another described wrapping his feet in spare cloth and laying a knife beside him, in case they started early. Still, these measures were never enough. When fatigue set in, precautions slipped. A single lapse, a single uncovered tin or slack pack strap, and the rats returned in force. They weren't shy. They darted between legs during mealtime, scrambled over duckboards during inspections, even appeared during briefings. One officer paused mid-order to club a rat with his cane, then resumed without comment. Their presence had shifted from abnormal to inevitable. The emotional toll was cumulative. What began as annoyance turned to dread, then sank into resignation. Soldiers joked about them, calling them mascots, giving them names, Little Corporal, Jerry Jr., the night watch. Some claimed this gallows humor helped. But even those who laughed knew the truth. They weren't pets and they weren't leaving. The rats had achieved something no enemy barrage could. They had made peace unbearable. A soldier might brace himself during a bombardment, grip his rifle and wait, knowing the danger had a rhythm. But in the lulls, in the quiet, the rats came. They were not preceded by whistles or screams. They simply emerged. Private Harold North's letter to his sister painted this quietly. They don't even care anymore, Mary. I watched one walk across my foot last night. Just walked, slow as anything, like it owned the place. I was too tired to kick it. Didn't even flinch when I lit a match. There was no pride in the telling, only exhaustion. The kind of weariness that dulled every instinct until even disgust had faded. Sometimes they fought each other, great, snarling clumps of brown and gray tumbling in the dirt over scraps of meat or territory. The sounds were brutal, high-pitched shrieks, the wet slap of fur against fur, the soft crunch of bone. Soldiers would sometimes pause to watch, mesmerized in their misery. More than one account compared these brawls to bayonet practice, not because of the violence, but because of the intimacy. Fangs in flesh, claws raking down backs, blood spilled and steam rising from warm bodies. One sergeant reportedly placed bets on them. A cruel diversion, but hardly the cruelest scene during the war. The rats were reliable fighters, and men who couldn't control anything else took some satisfaction in naming a champion, watching it tear through smaller rivals. But the fights never lasted long. The winner vanished into a burrow, the loser twitched in the mud, and the men returned to their duties, unsettled by how quickly the arena emptied, how quickly the rats resumed their usual roles, unseen everywhere. No one had to explain that the rats were filthy. That knowledge was instinctive, part of the revulsion that gripped even the most hardened soldier at the sight of a twitching tail or the dark smear of a nest dug into the trench wall. But it wasn't just dirt they carried. It was something deeper, invisible, something that clung to their bodies and passed into the air, the water, the bloodstream. Men spoke of sickness the same way they spoke of snipers or gas. Not always visible, not always near, but always waiting. And often it came by way of the rats. Illness swept through the trenches not in waves but in pulses, striking here, then there, in clusters that flared and vanished. And more often than not, the starting point was a latrine or a dugout or a drinking container that had been contaminated by rat activity. The connection wasn't always obvious at first. Men got fevers in the trenches for all kinds of reasons. But as the months dragged on and the sick bay filled with the same aching bodies and burning eyes, patterns began to form. The rats weren't just eating the rations. They were poisoning the men who survived on them. Leptospirosis was rarely named but frequently felt. Caused by bacteria in rat urine, it spread silently through puddles and pooled water, infecting men through cuts on their feet or hands, through the thin skin between toes, even through the eyes if they rubbed their faces after touching the boards. Its symptoms came in layers. First a headache, then chills, then vomiting. The fever spiked and fell without warning. In some, it passed in a few days. In others, it deepened into jaundice, organ failure, death. One orderly at an aid station near Ypres recalled men arriving with eyes like burnt coins, too dehydrated to speak, shaking as though the cold had sunk into their bones. But it was trench fever that earned the greatest dread. Spread by lice that also infested the rats, it began as a low ache behind the eyes and grew into a roaring pain that stretched down the back and legs. The fevers came in cycles, dragging on for weeks, sometimes months. Men recovered only to relapse again days later. It wasn't fatal in most cases, but it ruined a man's usefulness. Dozens were pulled from the line not by wounds or fatigue, but by a sickness that had no cure, no antidote, only time and isolation. And in the crowded medical huts, surrounded by coughing, shaking bodies, time was the one thing in short supply. Private Daniel Roby of the East Surreys wrote home during one of his bouts, "My joints are so sore I can't stand. I think the lice are in my ears. They say the fever isn't deadly, but it feels like being buried slow. One of the lads died yesterday, not from the fever, but because he slipped into the latrine when the dizziness took him. Drowned in filth. It was the kind of death no one wanted to talk about. Not gallant, not noble. Just a slow suffocation beneath the waist of 1,000 men, likely stirred by rats the night before. Typhus remained the most feared, though it was rarer. Spread through fleas and lice, it came with ferocity. Fever, rashes, delirium, and, for many, death within a week. Outbreaks were contained with difficulty, often only by burning bedding, uniforms, and entire dugouts. Some believed it spread through the rats directly. Others thought the lice were merely hitching rides on their backs. Either way, when the diagnosis came, men were pulled from the trench like infected timber from a fire. They weren't given much hope, and when they died, their corpses were wrapped tightly, soaked in disinfectant, and buried far from the living. Even among those who survived these afflictions, the aftermath lingered in unexpected ways. The body's recovery didn't guarantee the mind's. Men who'd endured trench fever or leptospirosis often returned to duty with sunken cheeks and trembling hands, their gait uncertain, their tempers short. Doctors noted a peculiar form of lethargy among the recovered, as if some vital spark had dimmed inside them. A few were marked as malingerers when they couldn't resume full duties, accused of feigning illness to avoid the front. But others knew better. They had seen how the sickness wore a man down from the inside, stripping not just strength, but a will to resist. Rats were rarely mentioned directly in the medical reports, but they were there, haunting the margins of every diagnosis. One field surgeon near the Somme scribbled in his log, "Trench fever again, 14 cases today. Lice, rats, filth, the holy trinity of disease out here." It was a bitter joke, but it captured the truth. Rats moved between the dying and the barely living, chewing through contaminated bandages, dragging lice-infested scraps from one dugout to another. In field hospitals hastily assembled in barns and collapsed chapels, doctors began to see them not just as a symptom of squalor, but as a mobile vector of contagion. Their presence also complicated care. Wounded soldiers were left to rest in cots or stretchers placed close together in dimly lit spaces. At night, rats moved freely between them. Nurses took to walking the aisles with sticks, swatting at the floorboards, stamping near corners. In one Canadian medical unit, a nurse wrote home that the rats had chewed through the soles of 4 boots left beside a stove, and that she no longer dared leave her basin uncovered at night. Some even reported bites, usually on the feet, but sometimes on hands or faces, if a soldier was feverish and too weak to swat them away. This erosion of boundaries between the patient and the vermin, the ill and the scavenger, spoke to a larger breakdown of order. War had always brought disease, but the trench environment magnified it. The rats weren't separate from the illness. They were part of the same ecosystem, a closed loop of decay. They consumed the flesh of the dead and helped transmit the infections that created more corpses to feed on. Soldiers who fell sick with typhus or trench fever were often nursed alongside men dying of wounds, and sometimes died more slowly, more pitifully. No sudden spray of blood or final heroic breath. Just a long decline into fever dreams, hallucinations, and finally stillness. Captain Ernest Lawton, a medical officer stationed near Armentières, wrote in his journal, "We can treat wounds, we can amputate, but we have little for the sickness. They lie for days in sweat-drenched wool, eyes fluttering open to hallucinations of home, or worse, of things in the trench." One man screamed about rats in his stomach. I think he believed it. He died that night. Lawton's entry was not uncommon. Delirium blurred the lines between memory and nightmare, and in the half-lucid fever state, rats often returned. Not as real animals, but as specters crawling beneath the skin, chewing from within. There was, in the end, a quiet understanding among the men. Being bitten by a rat wasn't just an unpleasant incident. It could mean the start of a sickness no one would name but everyone feared. Some bites became infected quickly. Swelling spread along the limb. Red streaks formed beneath the skin. Without proper antiseptics, and those were in short supply, amputation followed. Others never made it that far. Septicemia took them in hours. A simple rat bite, received in sleep, could be a death sentence. Medical bulletins tried to keep pace with the outbreaks, but behind the lines, theory lagged far behind necessity. Physicians argued over terminology, over how certain diseases spread, over whether lice came from the men or from the rats or from the mud itself. Microscopes were scarce and autopsies often rushed. There was little time to trace pathogens when the sick kept arriving in droves. What passed for understanding was often guesswork, refined only by repetition. By the third year of war, most doctors knew what to expect just by looking into a man's eyes. That sunken, glassy gaze, unblinking, dull with fever, it was usually trench fever. A sudden rash down the abdomen? Typhus. Bright yellow skin and bleeding gums? Likely leptospirosis. The rats had delivered their payload, and the body told the rest. Yet, despite this grim familiarity, there was very little that could be done for most sufferers. Treatments were crude: bed rest, fluids if they could swallow, quinine in some cases. If the fever worsened, they were isolated. Blankets were boiled, uniforms burned. Sometimes, entire dugouts were evacuated, fumigated with chloride of lime or set alight if the infestation was too deep. And always, there were the rats, watching from the shadows, waiting for the fire to die down so they could scavenge the remains. Cleanliness was an impossible standard. Attempts at trench sanitation were constant but doomed. Waterlogged soil refused to drain. Latrines overflowed during bombardments or collapsed altogether. When men tried to dig new waste pits, they often struck old ones, releasing months of rot and bacteria into the trench floor. Disinfectants were rationed, soap was precious, and lice could not be scrubbed away. If a man went 2 days without itching, he assumed he had a fever. If he found his rations untouched in the morning, he checked himself for wounds, because it meant the rats had found something tastier the night before. More than one soldier came to see the entire trench as a kind of wound, open, infected, pulsing with life not their own. And in that wound, the rats thrived. They were not just part of the filth. They were its engine. They dragged pieces of rot from one end to another. They gnawed at the boundaries between clean and contaminated. They turned corpses into disease vectors, garbage into poison. What the shellfire didn't destroy, they contaminated. And once illness set in, they stayed close, as if drawn to the scent of suffering. Among officers and field medics, there were grim jokes about promoting the rats, giving them stripes or medals for service rendered. But no one truly found it funny. The black humor was a shield against despair. Because beneath the laughter was the knowledge that the rats were winning. They outnumbered the soldiers. They adapted faster. They learned the rhythms of the trenches better than most men ever could. And their toll, measured in fever, gangrene, and death, rivaled that of any enemy artillery barrage. In one of the final entries in a nurse's diary from 1918, scrawled in a hand barely legible from exhaustion, she wrote, "3 boys gone this morning. 2 were wounded, 1 was not. He'd been sick for days. I think it was the fever. Can't be sure. His body was cold and the rats had already come. I tried to chase them, but I couldn't keep up. They always find them first. Sleep, or rather the absence of it, became another enemy soldiers had to contend with. The perpetual noise of the trenches, the constant barrage of artillery, the shrieks of unseen shells, all these might have been expected in war. But the rats, those insidious creatures, often proved to be the final straw. They were an unseen presence that gnawed at men's minds as much as their bodies. It was their very persistence, the way they slinked into every corner, chewed at rations, and scuttled across sleeping soldiers, that wore men down. Sleep deprivation began to manifest in unpredictable ways. Some men fell into stupor-like states, unresponsive and listless, while others developed strange, jittery habits. Constantly checking their equipment, staring into the darkness as though expecting an attack from below. There were no clear boundaries between the waking and the sleeping hours, no true respite. A man who thought he had finally drifted into a short, necessary nap would be jolted awake by the feeling of tiny feet scuttling across his chest or the unmistakable sound of gnawing. It wasn't just the physical presence of the rats that disturbed them. It was the helplessness. Soldiers could fight bullets and shells, could take cover and retaliate, but they could do nothing against these creatures. They were part of the environment, as entrenched in the trench system as the men themselves. If war was a war against enemies, then the rats were something worse. An enemy without form, without face, without rules. They attacked at all hours. The enemy had patterns. The rats didn't. This unpredictability fed a deeper fear, a fear that wasn't just about the rats, but about the soldiers themselves. Had they become too numb to react to the creeping terror? Had their minds, dulled by weeks of stress and sleeplessness, begun to accept the constant gnawing presence of the rats as normal? The mental strain was evident in the correspondence soldiers sent home. One letter, sent from a forward trench near the Ypres salient, reads, "I don't know how much longer I can do this, Mary. The rats come every night. Sometimes I wake up and think I feel them crawling on me. I know it's the fever, but it doesn't matter. My mind's gone. We're all walking dead here." The sentiment was shared by many. They had no words for what they felt, but the fear of rats, creeping into the corners of their lives, became synonymous with the fear of losing themselves. The fear of becoming so disconnected from the present, so worn by constant assault, that even the simple act of staying awake or going to sleep would become a battle. It wasn't long before the rats began to embody something far deeper, the symbol of the trench itself. The muddy earth, the constant damp, the feeling of being trapped in a hole without escape. All of it felt as though it had fused into the very essence of these creatures. They were the perfect symbol of dehumanization. The rats didn't care for rank or status. They didn't care for the old distinctions of before the war. They moved across every man's life in the same way, from officer to private, from the healthy to the sick. Their incessant gnawing at the edges of the men's sanity was just another reflection of the war's total erosion of human identity. They were the rats of war, not to be ignored or shrugged off as a nuisance, but part of the horror that transformed each man into something lesser, something more akin to the scavengers who inhabited the trench with them. The more soldiers were forced to endure, the more the rats became intertwined with the dread of shell shock. Both were invisible wounds, both left no clear marks on the body, but both slowly ate away at the soul. Fear of shellfire, once the overwhelming terror of war, became somewhat familiar, even somewhat predictable. Soldiers could brace themselves for the incoming bombardment, take shelter in dugouts, and wait. The sound of a rat, on the other hand, was the sound of the unknown. There was no warning, no way to prepare for it. It wasn't just the sudden appearance of the rat that broke a man. It was the certainty that there was no refuge from it. A soldier might brace himself for the whistling of a shell or the thunder of distant artillery, but the sound of rats in the night was omnipresent, a reminder that no corner of the trench was ever safe. And while men did learn to cope with the shellfire, they could never learn to anticipate the gnawing of rats, the scuttling that began when everything else was still, when it was only the darkest hours of night and the last shred of sleep slipping away. Another soldier, one whose letter was intercepted by the army censors, wrote, "I've seen men break from the sound of rats. Not the bullets or the shells, but the damn things. You get to the point where you're so tired, so worn, that when one of them runs across your chest, you forget who you are. You forget the war. It's like they make you less than a man." This profound feeling of dehumanization mirrored the experiences of those suffering from shell shock. The same inability to grasp onto any stable reality, the same gradual erasure of individual identity. The rats didn't just invade the trenches. They invaded the minds of the soldiers, stripping away their sense of self, their agency, until all that remained was the endless cycle of survival. As the war wore on, the divide between man and beast blurred. The soldiers, exhausted and overwhelmed, started to identify with the rats in ways that felt almost unnatural. There was something about the constant gnawing, the scavenging, the way the rats were always looking for a way to survive despite impossible odds, that mirrored their own existence. A soldier wrote in his diary, "Sometimes I think we've become like the rats. We hide during the day, sneak out at night. If you're not quick enough, you get left behind." It wasn't just the rats that thrived in the trenches. It was the instinct to survive, no matter the cost. But that survival came at a cost too. A cost to the mind, the psyche, the soul. This constant strain of sleeplessness, fear, and degradation began to take a toll on the soldier's mental health. In his memoirs, Captain Edward Barlow reflected, "There's something primal in the way we're forced to live here. is not about bravery or courage anymore. It's about enduring. And even the rats have more dignity than we do, scuttling around and surviving on scraps. We're the ones who've lost the right to be human. That feeling of losing one's humanity became a recurrent theme in the correspondence between soldiers. Letters to family often included references to the sense of being unclean or less than human, as if the very act of fighting had eroded their identities. "I don't know who I am anymore," wrote one soldier in a letter to his mother. "Out here, it's like we're all the same, crawling through the mud, just like the rats." There was a growing sense that the soldiers were caught in a trap of their own making, trapped in a cycle of fear and deprivation that had no end. What made the rats so terrifying wasn't just their numbers or their habits. It was the way they seemed to represent the inescapability of the soldiers' plight. Men often joked about rats more than they actually talked about them, as a defense mechanism. But deep down, they knew the truth. It was not the rats that were truly the enemy. It was the system they had found themselves in. The rats were just a reminder of how small they had become in the eyes of the war, how little control they had over their own fate. It became clear that the psychological toll of war extended far beyond the physical injuries soldiers suffered. Chronic sleep deprivation, worsened by the constant fear of rats, exacerbated the conditions of the mind. Soldiers who had survived heavy shelling or hand-to-hand combat began to show signs of mental collapse far more severe than any physical wound. They could no longer distinguish between dreams and reality, between the touch of a rat and the brush of a comrade's hand. The terror of rats in the night became indistinguishable from the terror of war itself. In one particularly chilling diary entry, a soldier recorded, "The lines between what's real and what's not have started to fade. When I wake up, I don't know if I'm safe or if I'm dead. And every time I hear that rustling, I think it's the rats. It's all the same now." The creeping paranoia among the men grew as a result of this mental strain. In the trenches, the soldiers had little contact with the outside world. Their interactions were confined to the men around them, and the more stressed they became, the more they relied on the small comforts they could cling to. Small rituals like checking weapons, keeping food tins tightly sealed, or sweeping the floor for any signs of intrusion. But even these rituals couldn't stave off the fear. The rats, after all, didn't need to follow rules. They moved freely across the barricades, burrowing into shelters, gnawing at supplies, and, above all, violating the soldiers' most precious commodity: peace. The fear wasn't confined to the trench. Some men began to hear the sound of rats scurrying even when they were safely behind the lines, in their billets or at the rear. It was a collective paranoia. The soldiers no longer just feared the rats in their sleep. They feared the rats in their minds, the rats that would follow them wherever they went. This was the burden of living in constant fear. Not the clear, immediate fear of a sniper's bullet or the explosive impact of artillery, but the deeper, more insidious fear of something that could never be fully understood or controlled. The rats were shadows, always just out of sight, creeping around the periphery of the soldier's mind. They were a metaphor for the disintegration of everything familiar, the sanctity of the human body, the line between predator and prey, the mental clarity that once separated a soldier from his surroundings. Even after the war, when soldiers returned home, the specter of rats never truly left them. In letters home, many men wrote not just of the horrors they had faced, but of the mental scars that lingered long after the last shot had been fired. "They say the rats will leave when the war ends," one soldier wrote, "but they don't. Not really. They're here, inside me, in the dark. I still hear them." The rats had become more than just physical creatures. They had become a symbol of the war itself, a symbol of everything the men had lost, everything they could never forget. In the trenches, every inch of ground was contested, from the enemy across no man's land to the unyielding forces beneath. And when soldiers found that rats had become more than just an irritant, more than a nuisance, they realized they needed a strategy. In the early days of trench warfare, the concept of rat combat seemed absurd to those who had not yet experienced the scale of the problem. But as the weeks turned to months and the rats grew in number, necessity became the mother of invention. Soldiers began to develop crude, improvised weapons and techniques to combat the vermin that infested their daily lives. One of the earliest and simplest methods employed was the creation of rat traps. These traps were often fashioned out of whatever materials were available: old tin cans, broken bits of wood, discarded wire, and even bits of clothing. The goal was simple: to catch and kill as many rats as possible. The ingenuity of the soldiers in designing these traps varied widely, from simple snap traps to more elaborate mechanisms designed to ensnare multiple rats at once. But no matter how clever the design, there was a consistent frustration. The rats seemed to outsmart them. They were quick, adaptable, and cunning. They learned how to avoid the traps, how to gnaw through ropes or slip past metal wires. It was as though the rats were engaged in a silent war of attrition against the men, each day testing new ways to remain one step ahead. At the same time, soldiers attempted to enlist the help of animals to do what they could not. Cats were often brought into the trenches with the hope that their natural hunting instincts would help reduce the vermin population. However, even the most ferocious cats were often ill-equipped for the task. The conditions in the trenches were harsh and unsanitary, making it difficult for the cats to thrive. Many of them died from disease or were killed by the constant shelling and explosions. And even when a cat managed to kill a rat, there was always the chance that another rat would soon take its place, ready to resume the war. It wasn't long before dogs were enlisted, too. But like the cats, the dogs faced significant challenges. The rats were often faster than the dogs, and the chaos of the trenches, with its constant bombardment and shifting earth, made it difficult for the animals to do their job. Worse still, the rats became increasingly aggressive as the war went on. Rather than fleeing, they began to fight back, often swarming and attacking the dogs and cats that were meant to control them. In response to the growing rat problem, official army directives were issued regarding vermin control. These directives came from military headquarters, but the response was often a patchwork of strategies that varied widely from unit to unit. In some cases, soldiers were provided with a limited supply of chemical repellents. These chemicals, often derived from pesticides and insecticides, were sprayed around the trench and on supplies to deter rats. But the effectiveness of these chemicals was debatable. While they did kill some rats, they often had limited reach and failed to prevent the rats from returning. Moreover, the chemicals had unintended consequences. The soldiers, already suffering from harsh conditions and limited supplies, found that exposure to these chemicals could cause irritation to the skin and eyes. In some cases, soldiers even reported feeling ill after prolonged exposure, leading some to question whether the effort to control the rats was worth the cost. Perhaps the most controversial method of rat combat was the widespread use of fire. Soldiers would sometimes set fire to piles of garbage or debris, hoping that the smoke would drive the rats from their burrows and force them into open areas where they could be more easily killed. However, this approach was often counterproductive. The rats, being highly adaptable, would simply move deeper into the trenches or into underground tunnels, where the fire could not reach them. The fires themselves, though intended to deal with the rats, often had disastrous side effects. The same fire that was meant to clear out vermin would also endanger the soldiers and their supplies, with the smoke choking the air and making it difficult to see or breathe. The response to the rat problem was so disjointed and ineffective that some soldiers began to take matters into their own hands. They would resort to extreme measures in an attempt to rid themselves of the vermin. Some soldiers reportedly used their rifles to shoot at rats, though hitting a moving target in the dark of a trench was no easy feat. Others took to hunting them with bayonets, stabbing blindly into the dark, hoping to catch a rat in the crossfire. These acts, though they might seem absurd, were a reflection of the mental and emotional toll the rats had taken on the soldiers. They were no longer just pests. They were enemies, insidious creatures that had become as much a symbol of the war as the enemy soldiers themselves. The frustration of fighting a battle that could never be won only deepened the sense of hopelessness and dehumanization that had already begun to take hold in the trenches. As the war continued, the rat problem grew so severe that it became not just a matter of personal inconvenience, but a significant logistical and health concern. It was clear that the traditional approaches, whether they involved traps, animals, or chemicals, were insufficient. The rat menace was not simply a nuisance. It was an ever-present threat that endangered the health and well-being of every soldier in the trenches. The rats had adapted to their surroundings, thriving in the very conditions that had been designed for the soldiers' survival. In response, the military began to consider more systematic approaches to rat control, though even these were plagued by their own difficulties and limitations. One of the more institutionalized approaches involved the creation of rat-catching units within the British Army. These units were often formed from local men who had been trained specifically in the art of vermin control. They were tasked with laying rat poison in the trenches, setting traps, and clearing out rat nests. Despite the specialized focus, these rat-catching squads were often ill-equipped for the task. The rats, as it turned out, were incredibly resourceful and highly resilient. When the soldiers weren't actively in the trenches, they would take refuge in the subterranean tunnels, burrowing deeper into the earth where poison and traps had limited effect. Furthermore, many soldiers observed that the rats would scavenge the bodies of the fallen, feeding on both their comrades and the rats killed by poison, which only perpetuated the cycle of infestation. The growing reliance on chemical solutions became a double-edged sword. The use of rat poison did indeed reduce their numbers in certain areas, but it also created new hazards. Some soldiers complained that the poison had made the food supplies toxic, as the rats, being omnivores, would nibble on anything, from scraps of food to contaminated supplies. The rats' death throes, their festering bodies scattered throughout the trench systems, also introduced new health risks. As these corpses decomposed, they became breeding grounds for bacteria, exacerbating the already dire sanitary conditions. The issue of sanitation in the trenches was critical, and it directly impacted the success of the rat control efforts. As soldiers struggled to maintain even the most basic levels of cleanliness in their shelters, rats found abundant food sources in the form of unburied waste and spoiled rations. The pervasive rot of the trenches seemed to encourage rat activity, making the task of control seem more like a futile gesture. The unsanitary conditions, combined with the use of chemicals and poisons, made the situation a dangerous one for the soldiers. Many found themselves trapped in a cycle where every method of rat control introduced a new problem, further complicating the already impossible task of managing life in the trenches. As the war dragged on, the rats became a symbol of the inescapable nature of warfare itself. Soldiers could kill some of them, but there were always more. The rats were not just physical pests. They were a constant reminder of the relentless nature of the war, a war that showed no mercy, that had no clear end. Even when a soldier could escape the constant roar of artillery or the presence of the enemy, the rats remained, gnawing away at the edges of their sanity. They symbolized the same unyielding forces that had put them in the trenches in the first place. Just as the soldiers were caught in an unending cycle of conflict, the rats were locked in a battle for survival against the very men who were supposed to control them. The psychological toll of the rats' presence cannot be overstated. They were not just a source of physical discomfort or annoyance. They were an emotional and mental drain. Soldiers often spoke of the constant vigilance required to guard against the rats' nocturnal raids. Every night, soldiers would lie awake, listening for the soft, creeping sound of tiny paws scrabbling over the ground, the gnawing of teeth against leather and wood. The fear was not always of being bitten by the rats, but of the feeling of being constantly under siege, of having no respite. The trench itself, which was meant to be a place of relative safety, had become a prison. The rats were its true inhabitants, moving in and out of the darkness with impunity, feeding off the refuse of war and the shattered lives of the soldiers who had no choice but to endure. Perhaps the most tragic consequence of these efforts, as futile as they were, was the soldiers' growing desensitization to the rats. In the beginning, there was shock and repulsion when a rat scurried across a soldier's foot or gnawed at the corners of a boot. But over time, this initial disgust gave way to something far darker: indifference. The rats became just another part of life in the trenches, another enemy that could never be fully defeated. In the same way that the soldiers grew accustomed to the sounds of shellfire and the constant threat of death, they grew accustomed to the rats. The rats were no longer pests. They were a part of the war, just as much as the mud, the lice, or the guns. The soldiers began to accept their presence, a grim acknowledgement that they would never escape. As the rats proliferated in the trenches, soldiers found themselves grappling with a terror that could not be easily vanquished. Their physical environment had become a place of constant battle, not just against the enemy across no man's land, but against the creatures that scuttled through the mud, gnawing away at their sanity. In response to this unrelenting nuisance, the soldiers developed a series of rituals, superstitions, and dark humor strategies to cope with the fear and disgust that the rats evoked. These coping mechanisms became a vital part of life in the trenches, allowing the men to endure an impossible situation by turning the rats into something they could control, if only in their minds. One of the most prevalent and enduring symbols to emerge from this period was the idea of King Rat. This figure, often depicted as a larger-than-life, almost mythical creature, was treated with a strange reverence by the men. They gave him a persona, almost elevating the rat to a position of mock royalty. In the absence of anything else to hold on to, soldiers needed something to both fear and respect. King Rat became a symbol of the omnipresent threat that hovered over them, something they could neither escape nor defeat. The rat was not merely an enemy but an enduring force, a creature that had learned to thrive in the same mud and filth that the soldiers had to endure. There were even stories about how King Rat would be called upon by the rats to oversee their domain, ensuring that their raids on food supplies and soldiers' belongings continued undisturbed. These tales, circulating among the men, took on a life of their own. King Rat wasn't just a myth. He became a part of the soldiers' shared experience. One soldier, recounting a particularly harrowing night, joked, "The king himself was here last night, prowling the trenches. He was too large for the traps. He only respects the rats who are brave enough to face the human army." This humor, steeped in gallows irony, was one of the ways the soldiers kept their spirits up. It was, in a sense, a way to domesticate the terror, to place it under the soldiers' control, however fleetingly. In addition to the figure of King Rat, trench life became rich with dark humor, much of it directed at the rats. The men developed entire vernaculars around their shared experience with the vermin. One of the most popular traditions was the creation of trench cartoons and rhymes that depicted the rats as ever-present adversaries. These cartoons, often drawn in the margins of personal letters or scratched onto scraps of paper, portrayed the rats as characters in their own right. Sometimes, they were shown as bumbling creatures, clumsy in their attempts to steal food or burrow into supplies. Other times, they were drawn as sinister, intelligent creatures, capable of outwitting the soldiers at every turn. The more the soldiers faced the rats, the more these sketches evolved, taking on a life of their own. Some of the most humorous and disturbing stories to come out of the trenches involved mock ceremonies designed to cope with the rat terror. Soldiers would sometimes stage elaborate rituals to honor the rats they had killed, setting up tiny makeshift altars or creating faux funerals for the rats that had met their end in a trap. These absurd ceremonies provided a release for the tension that built up during the long hours of waiting and suffering. At times, these rituals would even mock the more formal ceremonies of the army or religion, taking the structure of military protocol or church rites and twisting them into something absurd and grotesque. It wasn't uncommon for a soldier to address the fallen rat as if it were a comrade, eulogizing it with words that poked fun at the grim reality they were living in. "Here lies the bravest of rats," one soldier might say, whose sacrifices ensured that none of us would ever sleep again in peace. These rituals were an outlet, a means of processing the psychological strain, turning something horrifying into something almost absurd. The dark humor continued in trench newspapers, where cartoons, rhymes, and short stories about rats often became recurring themes. The soldiers who ran these newspapers, often from their own ranks, used the opportunity to express the collective despair, frustration, and absurdity they faced on a daily basis. One particularly popular cartoon in one such newspaper depicted a rat dressed in military garb, wielding a rifle and charging the trench lines, with a speech bubble that read, "You'll never catch me." This satirical take on the rats made them the subject of ridicule rather than fear, stripping them of some of their power over the soldiers. By reducing the rats to mere comic relief, soldiers were able to transform their terror into something manageable, a source of humor rather than hopelessness. Yet, these small, humorous acts were not only a response to the rats themselves but also to the broader sense of dehumanization that had overtaken the soldiers' lives. The trench rats were, in a way, a mirror to the soldiers' own transformation under the brutal conditions of war. Just as the rats had adapted to the trench environment, surviving where nothing else could, the soldiers had, too. They had learned to survive not just through physical endurance but through psychological adaptation, by making peace with the inescapable horror around them. In some ways, the laughter and humor helped them reclaim a piece of their humanity, even if it was just a fleeting moment amidst the grime and violence. The trench newspapers, filled with biting humor and depictions of the rats, were more than just an outlet for creative expression. They were a survival tool in their own right. They allowed soldiers to see the absurdity in their circumstances, to laugh in the face of fear, and to create a sense of camaraderie in an environment where isolation and despair were the norm. These publications, often scribbled on scraps of paper or drawn hastily in the quiet hours between artillery bombardments, became a way for soldiers to reclaim control over their lives, if only for a brief moment. The humor they shared in these pages wasn't just for amusement. It was a way to communicate their suffering, to remind each other that they weren't alone in their misery. The role of the trench mascot also became a critical part of this shared experience. While many soldiers found solace in the idea of King Rat and the strange rituals that surrounded it, they also sought out companionship in more tangible forms. Some soldiers kept rats as mascots, raising them in the trenches and giving them names, sometimes even treating them like pets. This act, which might seem strange to an outsider, was part of a deeper need for connection in an environment where human relationships were often strained to the breaking point. The rats, in a twisted sense, became a reflection of the soldiers themselves, survivors in a hostile, unforgiving world. These mascots became symbols of resilience, not only for the rats that endured the brutality of trench life, but for the men who shared in that same struggle. Interestingly, while the soldiers often found dark humor and solace in these rats and their antics, they also used them as a tool for venting frustrations about the larger war. The rats, in their grotesque, relentless nature, became a metaphor for the very enemy they were fighting. The same gnawing persistence with which the rats burrowed through supplies and ate through clothing mirrored the ways in which the war itself felt endless. For many soldiers, the rats were not just pests. They embodied the war's most maddening quality: the unrelenting, ever-present nature of the conflict, where every victory seemed temporary and every respite short-lived. This metaphorical connection between the rats and the war was often reflected in the soldiers' dark humor, particularly in their cartoons and songs. One popular song, passed along in hushed tones and sung in jest, lamented the futility of rat warfare, comparing it to the futility of war itself. You chase them with your boots, you chase them with your knife, but King Rat will never let you live your life. It was a reflection of how the soldiers felt trapped in an unending cycle. No matter how many rats they killed, there would always be more. In this sense, the rats came to symbolize the eternal struggle, the feeling that no matter how hard they fought, they would never fully win. The rats, it seemed, would always be one step ahead, as would the war itself. As the soldiers' morale continued to degrade under the strain of the war and the ever-present rat problem, these rituals, superstitions, and dark humor became more than just a way to cope. They were a form of resistance. By laughing at the rats, by mocking their ability to cause such widespread terror, the soldiers reclaimed some semblance of power. In the same way that the rats had learned to adapt to their environment, the soldiers adapted to their own circumstances. They learned to take comfort in absurdity, to find humor in horror, and to embrace the rituals that allowed them to make sense of the senselessness of their existence. For some soldiers, the presence of the rats eventually faded into the background, becoming just another part of the harsh landscape of trench warfare. But for others, the rats remained a constant reminder of their powerlessness, a manifestation of the forces that had trapped them in the trenches. The rats' dark reign over the soldiers' lives became a symbol not just of their enduring suffering, but of their ability to endure at all. The rats, with their relentless determination and almost supernatural resilience, embodied the soldiers' own fight for survival. In the midst of all this darkness, however, the rituals and humor brought something vital back to life in the trenches. The soldiers shared laughter, their inventive ways of coping, and their ability to make light of even the most terrifying circumstances allowed them to hold onto a fragile sense of identity and humanity. In their own twisted way, the rats had helped forge an unspoken bond between the soldiers, and in that shared suffering and dark humor, they found a way to endure the most grueling and inescapable of battles. While the British soldiers' experiences with rats in the trenches are the most well-documented, the problem was far from unique. Soldiers in other armies, French, German, Ottoman, faced similar vermin infestations, though the intensity of the issue and the ways in which it was dealt with varied. Each army brought its own cultural, military, and logistical approaches to the challenge, and these differences in attitude and action provide valuable insights into how rats were perceived and managed in the trenches of the Great War. Despite the shared hardships, the response to the rat problem was not uniform, influenced as it was by trench construction techniques, sanitation practices, and the broader social attitudes toward these creatures. In the French trenches, rats were also a significant concern, though French soldiers seemed to have a more resigned attitude toward them. Unlike the British, who often viewed rats with disgust or fear, the French soldiers had a more fatalistic view of their presence. They often considered the rats as just another part of the battlefield, not an extraordinary nuisance, but rather a constant companion in the madness of war. Their experience was influenced by the design of French trench systems, which in many cases were less sophisticated than the British counterparts. The French often constructed deep, narrow trenches that were poorly ventilated and prone to flooding, creating ideal conditions for rat infestations. However, the French were also more likely to embrace the idea that rats were a necessary evil, something to be endured rather than defeated. Many soldiers simply adapted to the rats, finding ways to coexist with them in the same way they learned to cope with the continuous artillery bombardments and the constant threat of death. Interestingly, the cultural perception of rats in French society may have also influenced how soldiers dealt with them. Rats, in French folklore and symbolism, were often seen as creatures of mischief, but not necessarily evil. Their omnipresence in the countryside and in urban areas, particularly in the poorer, more neglected parts of Paris, made rats familiar figures in the collective consciousness. This cultural familiarity could have led to a certain indifference toward them in the trenches. Soldiers might have seen them as just another part of the war's landscape, no different from the mud, the lice, or the constant hum of fear that buzzed in the air. In contrast, the German response to rats in the trenches was shaped by their military structure and trench-building strategies, which were more focused on efficiency and defensibility. German trenches were often more organized, with careful attention paid to sanitation and rat control. The Germans employed a variety of methods to combat the rat problem, including the use of specially trained dogs and rat catchers. Despite these efforts, the sheer volume of rats made eradication impossible. The German soldiers, however, had a more pragmatic approach to the problem, viewing the rats as a lesser concern compared to the more immediate dangers posed by enemy fire. They also had a tradition of military orderliness, which likely extended to the management of trench vermin. Nevertheless, the rats were still a constant presence, and the soldiers' attitudes toward them were shaped by a sense of stoic endurance rather than the dark humor or rituals that the British soldiers developed. German soldiers also faced unique challenges related to their trench design, which was often focused on creating elaborate, multi-layered fortifications. These trenches, while highly defensible, could sometimes create environments where rats thrived, especially in the deeper, less accessible areas. The Germans, like the French, often had to deal with overcrowded conditions and inadequate sanitation in certain sectors of the front. As in the British trenches, the problem of rats was compounded by the difficulty of keeping the trenches clean and dry, as well as by the lack of proper waste disposal. However, the German military took a more systematic approach to controlling the problem. Soldiers would routinely inspect their sectors for rat nests, and efforts were made to reduce the number of food scraps that would attract the vermin. Despite these efforts, the rats were always lurking in the background, gnawing at supplies and infiltrating the darkest corners of the trenches. Meanwhile, the Ottoman soldiers fighting on the Eastern and Gallipoli fronts also faced their own rat-related challenges. Ottoman trench systems were often less developed and less well-supplied than those of the Western powers, which created an environment that was especially conducive to rat infestations. Many of the Ottoman trenches were hastily constructed, often with little regard for long-term sustainability. This lack of planning and maintenance led to poor drainage, stagnant water, and abundant food waste, all ideal conditions for rats to flourish. However, the Ottoman soldiers' attitudes toward the rats were somewhat different from those of their European counterparts. In the Ottoman Empire, rats were often seen through a lens of superstition and cultural beliefs, which colored the soldiers' responses. Rats, while unwanted in the trenches, were not seen as the sinister symbols of death they were in Western European cultures. Instead, they were sometimes viewed with a certain level of mysticism, as creatures that represented resilience and adaptability, qualities that Ottoman soldiers needed to survive the harsh conditions of trench warfare. The difference in cultural views was reflected in the action soldiers took against the rats. While Western soldiers might have used more direct methods of control, such as poison, traps, or trained animals, Ottoman soldiers were more likely to use cultural remedies, sometimes involving the invocation of protective prayers or superstitions. The rats, in the context of Ottoman trench warfare, were not just physical pests. They were woven into the spiritual fabric of daily life. Superstitions about rats, their behavior, and their ability to foresee future events persisted even in the trenches. For instance, a rat seen running away from a soldier was sometimes interpreted as an omen of good luck, a sign that the soldier would survive the next battle. These differences in cultural perceptions of rats highlight how deeply ingrained beliefs influenced the soldiers' experiences and responses. While rats in the British and French trenches were mostly seen as grotesque, invasive creatures, in the German trenches, they were treated as part of the battlefield, a nuisance to be managed with efficiency. Meanwhile, in the Ottoman trenches, rats were entangled in the broader cultural and spiritual beliefs that shaped soldiers' daily routines. The varied approaches to rat control across the different armies reveal more than just tactical differences. They highlight the cultural disparities that influenced how soldiers coped with their shared problem. Trench construction, too, played a significant role in determining the severity of the rat infestation. While some armies focused on creating highly fortified positions, others were forced to improvise under far less ideal conditions, leading to varying levels of success in controlling vermin. One of the key differences lay in the sanitation practices employed across the front lines. In the British trenches, the combination of mud, overcrowding, and poor waste management created an environment that was essentially a breeding ground for rats. British soldiers often struggled to maintain hygiene, with food scraps and human waste providing ample nourishment for the rodents. Attempts at sanitation, such as the construction of latrines and disposal pits, were frequently undermined by the sheer volume of waste and the lack of proper drainage. This created conditions in which rats could thrive, multiplying quickly in the damp, dark spaces of the trenches. It wasn't uncommon for soldiers to find themselves battling both rats and lice at the same time, a testament to the depth of the hygiene problems in the British trenches. In contrast, the Germans, with their more organized military approach, tended to place greater emphasis on maintaining cleanliness. While their trenches were still plagued by rats, they made more consistent efforts to manage waste and food scraps, trying to limit the resources available to the vermin. The German trenches were also better equipped with systems for water drainage, which reduced the accumulation of stagnant water, a factor that contributed to rat proliferation. Yet, despite these efforts, rats were still an inevitable presence, their numbers fueled by the constant supply of food left behind by soldiers' daily routines. The German approach was largely pragmatic. The soldiers didn't expect to eliminate the rats entirely, but rather to manage their numbers and reduce their impact. On the Ottoman front, trench construction was often less sophisticated, and the soldiers were more exposed to the elements and the challenges of maintaining their positions. The relatively primitive conditions of many Ottoman trenches meant that sanitation was not always a priority, and the constant movement of troops exacerbated the problem of waste management. Many trenches were dug hastily, with little regard for long-term stability, and this lack of planning allowed rats to establish strongholds in the system's deepest, most neglected areas. The cultural attitudes towards the rats, however, shaped how the soldiers dealt with them. Unlike the Europeans, who viewed rats as a sign of filth and disease, the Ottomans held a more ambivalent view of these creatures. While they were certainly seen as pests, they were not met with the same level of loathing or fear that existed in other armies. In some instances, soldiers even viewed the rats as symbols of resilience, creatures that, like them, were able to survive in hostile environments. Interestingly, despite the cultural differences in attitudes toward rats, many soldiers across all armies developed similar methods of dealing with the problem. Regardless of national origin, soldiers resorted to makeshift traps, poison, and other improvised means to fight back against the relentless tide of vermin. However, while some armies, like the British and French, focused on manual solutions, such as setting traps or using trained animals, others, like the Germans, employed a more systematic approach to control. The German army issued specific directives to soldiers, encouraging them to destroy rat nests and limit food access. They also used more advanced pest control methods, such as chemical repellents, which were a precursor to modern approaches. However, these strategies had their limitations. While the rats might have been temporarily pushed back, the overcrowded conditions and constant supply of food meant that they would always return. In the French trenches, the rat problem often took on a more philosophical aspect. Soldiers, weary from constant bombardment and plagued by the sight of rats gnawing at their rations, often turned to humor as a means of coping. Some even joked about their inevitable fate, referring to the rats as the true victors of the war. In this context, the rats were not just pests but also symbols of the war's inescapable nature. The French soldiers' approach was not about eradication but rather about enduring the vermin as a part of the broader misery of trench life. This resigned acceptance, however, did not make the rats any less of a problem. The mud-caked trenches, combined with the sheer volume of human waste and discarded food, created an ideal habitat for the rats to thrive. The contrast between the British and German approaches highlights a key divide in how rat problems were dealt with across different fronts. While the Germans focused on controlling the rats with more structured methods, the British response was often more ad hoc. British soldiers might rely on personal ingenuity, such as constructing homemade traps out of tin cans or attempting to introduce more natural predators, like cats and dogs. Despite their best efforts, however, these methods often proved ineffective. The rats, with their ability to multiply at astonishing rates, seemed to outsmart the soldiers at every turn. This frustrating cycle only added to the soldiers' sense of helplessness. The trenches of World War I were home to countless dangers, but for many soldiers, the fear of rats was more intense, more immediate, and more psychologically consuming than the fear of enemy fire. This may seem surprising given the deadly nature of warfare, where artillery, bullets, and grenades were constant threats. Yet, in the minds of many soldiers, the rats were not just an annoyance. They were a living embodiment of the war's horror, gnawing at the soldiers' sanity and threatening their health in ways that the enemy could not. The rats' omnipresence, their unpredictability, and their ability to infiltrate every aspect of a soldier's life made them more frightening than the occasional sound of distant gunfire or even the deafening roar of an artillery shell. In the end, the psychological toll of the rats outweighed the physical danger posed by bullets and bombs, shaping soldiers' experiences on a level that was often invisible to those not directly involved in trench warfare. One of the most terrifying aspects of rats in the trenches was their immediacy. Unlike the sporadic gunfire that could come at any moment but would usually be distant or over quickly, the rats were ever present. Day and night, they scurried across the ground, their beady eyes glinting in the dark, always present, always hungry. It wasn't just that they were there. It was that they were everywhere, burrowing in the trenches, gnawing on soldiers' equipment, tearing into their rations, and infiltrating their sleeping quarters. Unlike the randomness of enemy fire, which could strike at any moment without warning, the rats were a constant. They became a part of the landscape, a fixture of trench life. Their presence was a reminder that, even when there was a temporary lull in the fighting, there was no escaping the war. They were a constant source of stress, a reminder that peace was unattainable in the trenches, no matter how quiet the battlefield became. In addition to their omnipresence, rats were unpredictable. Unlike the enemy, whose movements could often be anticipated through intelligence or careful observation, rats were unpredictable creatures. They could appear at any time, in any place. Soldiers who thought they were safe in their dugouts or who believed they had cleared out a nest of rats would find their peace shattered as more of the vermin would appear from nowhere. This randomness of their behavior, appearing at night, chewing through boots or biting soldiers in their sleep, made them a constant threat. The rats didn't respect the lines of battle. They could cross the front lines as easily as they could scuttle across a trench, showing no allegiance to the soldiers, no respect for the sanctity of the temporary shelters or trenches the men created. The unpredictability of the rats mirrored the very unpredictability of war itself, where soldiers could never be sure when the next threat would arise or where it would come from. This uncertainty added an extra layer of anxiety and fear that was hard to escape. Moreover, rats were creatures of darkness, often emerging when the soldiers were at their most vulnerable. When the fighting would lull, soldiers often found a few moments of respite to sleep or eat. But in the quiet, the rats would find their opportunities. A soldier might close his eyes for a few minutes only to wake up with a rat crawling across his face or gnawing at the edge of his coat. The most unsettling aspect of this wasn't just the physical threat that the rats posed, but the psychological impact. Being in a war meant living in a state of constant alertness, and the sudden surprise of a rat in the night would strip away any semblance of safety or peace. This sense of invasion, of having no refuge, no private space untouched by the violence and chaos of war, was a deep psychological wound that the enemy fire could never quite replicate. The soldiers' fear of rats was also amplified by their sense of helplessness. While they could fight back against the enemy using rifles, bayonets, and grenades, the rats were immune to these tools of war. The usual weapons of defense were ineffective against the vermin, and many soldiers felt that no matter how hard they tried, the rats would always outlast them. Attempts to trap or poison them were often futile, as the rats would adapt and find new ways to survive. Even the official army measures, like trained cats or dogs, proved limited in their effectiveness. There was no escaping the rats. They were relentless, and unlike bullets or shells, which could at least be dodged or blocked, rats found their way into every corner of a soldier's life. They were a constant, gnawing reminder of the futility of control in the trench environment, where even the most mundane actions, eating, sleeping, resting, were undermined by the relentless presence of the vermin. This fear of rats became even more pronounced when compared to the fear of enemy fire. The latter was often associated with a distant, impersonal threat. Soldiers might hear the whistle of an incoming shell or the crack of a rifle shot, but the danger itself was abstract, originating from far away and not directly interacting with the individual soldier. On the other hand, the rats were personal. They didn't just represent an external threat. They were an invasive force, a physical presence that disrupted the soldiers' lives in very immediate and tangible ways. The psychological toll of constantly being surrounded by rats, never knowing when or where they would strike, was something far more unsettling than the occasional danger of enemy fire. Furthermore, the sheer number of rats made the threat seem even more insurmountable. Bullets could be dodged, shells could be outrun, but the rats multiplied and spread, and no matter how many were killed, there were always more to take their place. In this way, the soldiers' struggle with rats became symbolic of the larger struggle of trench warfare itself, a never-ending battle against an overwhelming, often invisible, force. The more they tried to fight, the more they were worn down. The rats were a daily reminder of the futility of their situation, a microcosm of the war itself, where victory always seemed out of reach. The psychological toll of rats went beyond mere inconvenience or physical discomfort. These creatures embodied a deeper, more existential fear for the soldiers. The constant presence of rats, with their ability to infiltrate every facet of trench life, eroded any sense of control that soldiers might have had. The battlefield was chaotic and dangerous, but the rats represented a different kind of danger, one that was more insidious and personal. While enemy fire was something that could be anticipated, dodged, or avoided with careful strategy, the rats were unpredictable and relentless. There was no escaping them, no moment of relief. The experience of constant intrusion, of never truly being alone, created a psychological strain that compounded the already overwhelming stress of war. This unyielding presence of rats also tapped into the soldiers' deepest fears: fear of disease, fear of contamination, and fear of dehumanization. The soldiers, already stripped of many of their basic human rights and comforts, found themselves contending with creatures that were inherently associated with filth, decay, and disease. The rats were vectors for illness, a constant reminder that the soldiers' bodies were not their own, that they were as vulnerable as the rats who scurried over them at night. The fear of these creatures represented more than just a fear of physical harm. It symbolized the total erosion of personal space, health, and dignity. In contrast to the distant, abstract nature of enemy fire, rats represented a very real and immediate threat to a soldier's personal well-being. The psychological weight of the constant presence of rats, combined with the physical discomfort and the sense of contamination they brought, made them a much more pervasive and invasive form of danger. Bullets and shells could leave soldiers physically scarred, but the rats left psychological scars that were harder to heal. In many ways, the rats embodied the very essence of trench warfare, a war of attrition that wore down not only the body but also the mind. They gnawed at the soldiers' sanity, at their sense of self, and at their ability to find any sense of peace or refuge in the chaos of the front lines. Moreover, the rats' association with death and decay further heightened their psychological impact. The rats were scavengers, feeding on the remnants of fallen comrades and soldiers' discarded food. They were tied to the very cycle of life and death on the front lines, a reminder that death could come from anywhere, even from within the very trench that was supposed to offer some form of protection. The idea that rats, in their search for food, might feed on the bodies of the fallen soldiers only added to the feeling of hopelessness and despair. It wasn't just the rats themselves that soldiers feared, but what they represented. A world in which death, decay, and disease were inescapable. Interestingly, the fear of rats became so pervasive that it began to take on symbolic meaning in the soldiers' minds. The rats were often used as a metaphor for the war itself, something that was seemingly endless, ever-present, and insurmountable. Just as the rats would never leave the trenches, the war seemed like a never-ending cycle of suffering. The sense of helplessness soldiers felt when dealing with rats mirrored the feelings they had towards the war. No matter how hard they fought or how many rats they killed, the problem would never be solved. The rats, in this way, became a symbol of the futility of war, a reminder that, in the trenches, there was no true escape from the horrors surrounding them. The enemy might seem distant at times, but the rats were always there, always feeding off the misery of the soldiers. They were an ever-present reminder of the soldiers' entrapment in a war that offered no resolution. Finally, the soldiers' fear of rats was also compounded by their isolation. While they were part of a unit, the trenches often felt like solitary places. Communication with the outside world was minimal, and soldiers were left to fend for themselves against the rats, which added to their sense of alienation and vulnerability. Unlike the distant fear of enemy fire, which could be shared and understood by fellow soldiers, the fear of rats was a personal experience. It was something that each soldier had to endure in his own way. Some soldiers might find solace in shared jokes about the rats, while others would become consumed by the terror of their nightly visits. In this sense, the rats not only represented an external threat, but also a deep internal struggle, one that isolated soldiers from each other as much as it connected them in their shared misery. The aftershocks of the Great War reverberated through the post-war world in many ways, and one of the most enduring legacies of the trenches was the image of the rat. Far from being forgotten in the aftermath of the war, these vermin became a powerful symbol that haunted both the minds of veterans and the collective cultural consciousness. The rats, in their relentless, terrifying presence, would come to embody the darker aspects of war. The dehumanization, the loss of innocence, and the unrelenting fear that plagued soldiers throughout their time in the trenches. These creatures would become more than mere pests. They would become metaphors for the trauma of war, represented in countless works of literature, art, and personal testimony. As soldiers returned home, the rats they had fought off in the trenches followed them into the written word, into the canvas, and into the policies that would shape the post-war world. Veterans' memoirs and autobiographies were some of the most powerful places where the rats of the trenches continued to live on. For many soldiers, the trauma of war was inseparable from their experiences with the rats. These creatures were woven into the fabric of their memories, representing not just the physical decay of war, but also the psychological toll it had taken on them. Rats were often described as an omnipresent, unyielding force, more terrifying than the enemy itself. Their ceaseless gnawing, their sudden appearances in the dead of night, their ability to infest every corner of the soldiers' lives. These were the details that came to define the soldiers' experience of the front lines. Even as the war ended, the rats lingered in the memories of those who had survived, their presence forever tied to the horrors of trench warfare. For many veterans, the rats became a symbol of the war's dehumanizing effects. In their memoirs, they often described how they and their comrades were reduced to little more than animals themselves, living in conditions that were unsanitary, brutal, and degrading. The rats, who were not bound by human laws of cleanliness and decency, represented the soldiers' own loss of dignity. The rats, as scavengers, thrived in the trenches precisely because they were able to take advantage of the soldiers' vulnerability, feeding off the waste and decay that surrounded them. In this way, the rats were symbolic of how war stripped away the humanity of the soldiers, reducing them to a mere survivalist existence, much like the vermin themselves. This comparison was not lost on the soldiers, many of whom used rats as a metaphor for their own dehumanization. Creatures that, like them, were fighting for survival in an environment that offered no peace, no refuge, and no hope of escape. In addition to memoirs, the image of the trench rat found its place in the wider cultural landscape, including in literature and art. Writers, poets, and artists of the interwar period often turned to the imagery of rats as a powerful tool to communicate the lingering horrors of the war. Authors like Erich Maria Remarque, Siegfried Sassoon, and Robert Graves incorporated rats into their depictions of trench life, using them as symbols of both the physical and psychological burdens that soldiers carried long after the war had ended. Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front famously uses rats to highlight the constant degradation and the total loss of normalcy that soldiers endured. For Remarque's characters, the rats were not merely pests. They were a reflection of the war's totality, representing the breakdown of civilization itself. Visual artists, too, were drawn to the image of the rats in their depictions of the war. Painters like Otto Dix and George Gross, known for their stark, often grotesque representations of war, included rats as part of their visceral portrayals of the trenches. In their works, the rats were not just creatures of the mud and filth. They were agents of chaos, embodiments of a war that had consumed both the body and the soul. In these works, rats were often shown alongside other symbols of war's brutality: dismembered bodies, barbed wire, and the suffocating, muddy landscapes that soldiers had to endure. The rats in these images were a stark reminder of the war's enduring physical and emotional scars, and their presence in post-war art only solidified their place as a symbol of the lasting damage wrought by the conflict. The power of the rat as a symbol extended beyond individual memoirs and works of art. In the years following the war, the fear of rats and the diseases they spread began to influence public health policy and vermin control efforts, particularly in Europe. The Great War had highlighted the dangers posed by the unchecked spread of rats, and the post-war years saw a concerted effort to address these issues. The idea of rat control became tied to broader public health initiatives, with the government and health agencies recognizing the importance of sanitation in preventing the spread of disease. In Britain, the government initiated large-scale efforts to control the rat population in urban areas, with the Ministry of Health urging local authorities to adopt measures to combat vermin. The war had underscored the connection between poor sanitation, disease, and public health, and the presence of rats in the trenches was a vivid reminder of the need for improved hygiene and pest control measures in civilian life. In France, the impact of the war on public health was similarly profound. The devastation of the trenches had created conditions in which rats could thrive, and the subsequent spread of disease was a significant public health concern. After the war, the French government embarked on an aggressive campaign to control the rat population in both rural and urban areas, using a combination of poison, traps, and other methods to reduce the number of vermin. The lessons learned from the trenches about the dangers posed by rats influenced this approach, with many public health officials stressing the need for cleanliness and proper waste management to prevent future outbreaks of diseases like typhus and leptospirosis. In Germany, the post-war response to rat-related health issues was equally urgent. The German government invested heavily in rat control, recognizing the rat's role in spreading diseases that could devastate the population. Vermin control programs were integrated into broader health reforms, with public health officials emphasizing the importance of sanitation and the elimination of rat breeding grounds. The association between rats and disease, forged in the trenches, was now being applied to civilian life, as governments across Europe took steps to prevent a repeat of the public health crises that had followed in the wake of the war. The reverberations of the trench rat experience extended into the realm of public health, influencing not only direct measures against vermin, but also shaping broader societal attitudes towards hygiene, disease, and the need for preventative measures. The connection between rats, disease, and the broader social consequences of the war led to a significant reevaluation of health policies during the interwar period. Governments, now deeply aware of the link between sanitation and the spread of illness, began to prioritize the regulation of vermin populations as a critical component of public health. The wartime emphasis on sanitation had underscored the grave danger that vermin posed in the context of not only war but also in everyday life. After the war, health campaigns sought to address the unchecked spread of diseases like typhus and trench fever, which had been directly tied to the rats of the trenches. This recognition of the rat's role in wartime illness catalyzed efforts to combat them in the civilian world, where outbreaks of similar diseases were still common, especially in the wake of the Great War's economic upheaval and social instability. In cities where the conditions of the trenches had replicated themselves in overcrowded, unsanitary living quarters, rats became a symbol of the war's ongoing impact, infecting communities long after the last shot had been fired. In Britain, the formation of organizations like the National Rat Catchers Association in the 1920s further institutionalized the war-driven focus on vermin control. These organizations, born out of the wartime need to manage rats in military zones, extended their reach to urban centers where rat populations had exploded in the aftermath of the war. The shift from individual pest control to organized, national-level efforts reflected a growing recognition of the importance of controlling vermin not only for public health but also for psychological well-being. The war had taught that the presence of rats was more than just a nuisance. It was an existential threat to the health and stability of society as a whole. In France and Germany, the consequences of the war on public health were similarly far-reaching. In both countries, rat control was seen as part of the larger task of rebuilding the national infrastructure and public trust after the devastation of war. In rural areas, particularly where trenches had once been dug, rats' presence in the aftermath of the conflict mirrored the destruction of the land itself. This reinforced the symbolic connection between the rats and the broader societal trauma. Rats, much like the war, had taken root in the very fabric of the landscape. Public health campaigns sought to address this by focusing on pest control as a means of restoring order and protecting the future from the devastating health crises that had accompanied the war. This extension of rat control into wider sanitation initiatives marked a direct outcome of the war's lasting imprint on everyday life. Culturally, the imagery of rats continued to haunt the literature and visual arts of the interwar period. While veterans sought to exorcise the rats from their minds, artists and writers continued to use them as symbols in their work. The symbolism of the trench rat, resilient, pervasive, and forever associated with the horrors of war, remained powerful. Writers like George Orwell would later evoke similar themes, using rats to illustrate the psychological and physical toll of oppressive systems. In post-war poetry, the rats were more than just vermin. They became metaphors for the lingering effects of trauma, the scars of war that could not be erased. The rats were part of the soldier's consciousness, manifesting in dreams and memories long after the fighting had stopped. The sense of creeping unease tied to the rat infestation in the trenches carried over into the broader societal narrative. In novels, poems, and even film, rats were depicted not only as agents of physical decay but also as representations of the moral and psychological degradation wrought by war. They became symbols of survival and adaptation in a brutal environment, an apt metaphor for the soldiers who had been forced to live through the unfathomable horrors of war. The constant presence of rats in post-war creative expressions underscored the persistent shadow that the war cast over the civilian world. The trench rat, then, became an emblem of more than just wartime survival. It was a symbol of resilience in the face of destruction, and a reminder that some scars are never fully healed. At the same time, the rat and its connection to disease, filth, and decay also began to be used as a vehicle for social critique. The growing awareness of public health and the need for cleanliness created fertile ground for commentary on the political and social conditions of the interwar years. Writers, especially those from the war generation, used the rat as a way to highlight the failures of society to protect its most vulnerable. Just as rats had flourished in the trenches, so too did poverty and inequality flourish in the aftermath of the war. The rat, as a symbol of neglect and decay, pointed to the broader systemic issues that had led to both the war and its lasting effects on the populace. In this sense, the trench rat became an enduring symbol not only of the soldiers' suffering but of the need for social reform and the rebuilding of a more just society. In the post-war period, the continued focus on rats and their symbolism in literature, art, and public health policy emphasized the deep, lasting scars left by the war. These creatures, seemingly insignificant in their physicality, came to represent the far-reaching consequences of the war that could not be easily erased. Their presence in soldiers' memories, in the streets of Europe, and in the artistic and literary movements that followed spoke to the profound and unrelenting nature of the war's impact. Rats, having once been the scourge of the trenches, would continue to haunt the cultural landscape of the interwar period, a constant reminder of the trauma that would never fully fade. The trench rats were not just the persistent, terrifying invaders of soldier spaces during World War I. They were, in many ways, a symbol of the broader human experience of the war. While the battlefield may have been defined by gunfire, barbed wire, and the ever-present threat of death from the enemy, the rats represented a different kind of war. The war against an unseen, unpredictable force that never relented. The constant, gnawing presence of rats in the trenches, their infestation of food supplies, equipment, and sleeping quarters, was a daily reminder of the hardships soldiers endured beyond the grandiose narratives of combat. In the larger story of the First World War, the trench rats have often been relegated to the margins, overshadowed by tales of heroic battles, immense sacrifices, and the iconic figures of war. However, in examining the phenomenon of the trench rat in detail, we uncover a significant aspect of the war's true human cost. A cost not measured in casualties alone, but in the psychological and physical toll that daily survival imposed on soldiers. This exploration helps us to understand the true scale of the conflict's impact on the individuals who lived through it. The rats in the trenches were, above all, a testament to the brutal conditions soldiers were forced to endure. Unlike the more visible and dramatic aspects of warfare, artillery barrages, charging infantry, and violent confrontations, the rats represented a constant, insidious form of suffering. They were not confined to moments of combat but were ever present, gnawing at the soldiers' resolve, their equipment, and, often, their very humanity. As much as rats were a public health concern, their role in the daily life of soldiers revealed the deeper psychological strain that living in the trenches caused. The rats were a reminder of the collapse of normality, the disintegration of any sense of safety, and the total subversion of basic human dignity. The seemingly mundane yet relentless nature of the rat's presence illuminated the pervasive and unrelenting nature of trench warfare itself, where survival was not simply about avoiding enemy fire but also about maintaining one's mental and physical well-being in the face of overwhelming adversity. To understand the trench rats is to understand one of the defining aspects of static warfare. Unlike the more fluid, mobile warfare of previous conflicts, World War I's trench warfare forced soldiers into extended standoffs with both the enemy and the environment. In these static conditions, soldiers found themselves subjected to the slow erosion of their bodies and minds. The rats were an integral part of this slow breakdown, as their presence highlighted the pervasive filth, disease, and deprivation that characterized life in the trenches. The rats were not a random affliction. They were a direct consequence of the stagnant, muddy, and unsanitary conditions soldiers faced daily. These conditions, created by the very nature of trench warfare, allowed vermin to proliferate unchecked, and in turn, the rats became symbols of the broader collapse of humanity that marked the war experience. For the soldiers, the rats were not just nuisances. They were harbingers of the decay that war inflicted upon them, physical, psychological, and moral. The trench rat phenomenon also plays a crucial role in understanding the cultural memory of World War I. Much of the war's legacy has been shaped by the images of battlefields strewn with the bodies of the fallen, the accounts of soldiers charging into enemy fire, and the heroism or futility of military campaigns. However, the deeper, less glamorous aspects of trench life, elements like the omnipresence of rats, have often been left in the shadows. These details, though seemingly small or insignificant compared to the grand scale of warfare, are key to understanding the true experience of the soldiers who fought in the war. By focusing on the rats, we gain insight into the unspoken suffering, the unacknowledged burdens, and the subtle ways in which war eroded the humanity of those who fought it. The rats were not just part of the backdrop of war. They were central to the day-to-day reality of the trenches, affecting soldiers in ways that the more obvious horrors of battle could not. In the silent hours between combat, when soldiers were left to themselves in the trenches, the rats became the enemies they could not escape. The lasting legacy of the trench rats extends beyond the immediate aftermath of the war into the way we understand and remember World War I. The horror of the rats has become a metaphor for the unseen costs of war, the invisible traumas that soldiers faced during their service. Their infestation of the soldiers' lives symbolized the endless nature of wartime suffering, the way in which soldiers were caught in a cycle of stress, fear, and deprivation that extended far beyond the battlefield. The rats were not mere pests. They embodied the psychological and emotional toll of war. Their constant presence mirrored the unrelenting nature of the soldiers' fears and anxieties, which did not end when the fighting ceased but persisted long after the war ended. The psychological scars of war, much like the rats, were persistent, hidden, and inescapable. The war, for many soldiers, did not truly end with the signing of the armistice. It continued to gnaw at them, like the rats that had infested their trenches. The war literature and art that emerged after World War I often reflected this lingering presence of the rats, as well as the ongoing trauma of the soldiers. Writers like Erich Maria Remarque and Siegfried Sassoon wrote of soldiers haunted by the memories of the trenches, memories that included not only the death and destruction but also the small, seemingly mundane horrors of trench life. The rats, then, became a shorthand for the psychological wounds of war, a symbol of the never-ending fight for survival in an environment that had stripped away all traces of humanity. These memories were not just about physical suffering. They were about the erosion of the human spirit, the degradation of soldiers to the level of mere animals, fighting for survival in a world where humanity seemed to have disappeared. Through their works, these authors and artists preserved the soldiers' experiences, ensuring that the full scope of the war's impact was not forgotten. The rats were part of that narrative, reminding us of the small, insidious ways in which war wore down its participants.